I never told my son-in-law there was a second safe. He spent 8 months looking for the first one. 8 months of polite questions at the dinner table, of my daughter passing along his innocent curiosity, of subtle comments about retirement and estate planning, dropped into conversations like fishing lures. He was patient. I'll give him that. Patient the way a man is patient when he believes the prize is worth the wait. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I spent 34 years building something worth protecting. I was a civil engineer. I designed bridges, water treatment plants, infrastructure that still stands in 3 states. I wasn't flashy about money. I drove a Ford pickup until the transmission gave out. I wore the same watch for 20 years. My wife, Dorothy, God rest her, used to joke that I was the only man in our neighborhood who knew exactly what was in every account and said nothing about any of it. She wasn't wrong. Dorothy passed 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. She was 61 years old, and she faced it the way she faced everything with more grace than the situation deserved. In her final weeks, when the house was quiet and our daughter would bring her tea, she couldn't drink anymore. Dorothy pulled me close one afternoon and said something I've never forgotten. She said, "Promise me you'll watch the ones who come after. Not our girl. She's good. But the ones who come after her." I promised. Our daughter, my girl, is the kind of person who sees the best in everyone. She always has been. When she was 9 years old, she befriended the meanest kid in her class because she said he was probably just sad inside. She was right, as it turned out. That boy ended up being a decent human being. But the world also contains people who are not sad inside. Some people are simply what they appear to be. She met her husband at a work conference in Austin 3 years ago. He was charming in the way that certain men practice charm deliberately, with purpose. He had a good handshake and a good story, and he looked at my daughter like she was the only person in the room. I watched him do it, and I thought about Dorothy's words. I told myself I was being a suspicious old man. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. They dated for 14 months. I watched him closely during that time. Not in any dramatic way. I just paid attention. I noticed that he asked questions about money in the first week of meeting me casually, framed as interest in my career, but still. I noticed that when my daughter mentioned donating to a charity she cared about, he made a small face, just for a second. I noticed that he never once asked about her childhood, her memories, what made her laugh when she was small. He asked about the house. He asked about the lake property. He asked, twice, whether I had siblings who might complicate things down the road. 2 months before the wedding, I called my attorney. My attorney is a woman named Carla who has handled our family's legal affairs for 19 years. She is methodical, unsentimental, and she does not waste words. I sat across from her desk and I told her what I observed and what Dorothy had said and what I intended to do. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she set down her pen and said, "You're not wrong to do this. Let's make it airtight." We spent 6 weeks restructuring everything. The lake property went into a revocable trust with my daughter as sole beneficiary, not her husband, not any future joint estate, her alone. The investment accounts were reorganized. A separate family trust was established for any future grandchildren, structured so that the assets bypassed my daughter's marital estate entirely. The only thing that remained in my own name, visible and simple, was the house I lived in and one checking account. I also, on Carla's recommendation, created a clear and specific paper trail. Every transfer, every restructuring, dated, witnessed, filed, not because I expected a legal fight, but because a man who had studied the terrain for 8 months would need to understand that the terrain had been changed before he arrived. The wedding was in September. It was a beautiful day. I won't take that from them. My daughter wore a dress that had belonged to Dorothy's mother. She cried when she put it on. I stood at the back of the room with her uncle from Flagstaff, and I watched her walk down that aisle, and I felt 2 things at once. The pure, uncomplicated love a father feels watching his child begin her life, and a cold, quiet alertness that I have felt on job sites when the ground doesn't sound right underfoot. At the reception, my son-in-law found me at the bar. He put his arm around my shoulder the way men do when they want to seem familiar. He said, "Now that we're family, I hope we can be more open with each other." He was smiling. It was a good smile. I smiled back and I said, "I've always been open. I'm an easy man to read." He laughed. We clinked glasses. He moved on. I thought about that moment for a long time afterward. The first year of their marriage was quiet on the surface. They bought a house, a nice one, more expensive than made sense given what I knew of his income, but my daughter had savings, and she was generous. I visited for holidays. I watched. He was attentive to her in public, and occasionally dismissive in private. The kind of dismissiveness that is easy to miss if you're not looking for the pattern. A small interruption, a correction offered in front of others, a sigh, when she told a story he'd heard before. Small things, brick by brick. In the second year, he started coming to see me alone. The first time, he said he was just in the neighborhood. We had coffee. He asked how I was managing the house on my own, whether I'd thought about downsizing. I said I liked things as they were. He nodded and moved on. 6 weeks later, he came again. This time, he asked directly whether I had a financial advisor. I told him I had an attorney who handled my affairs. He suggested, warmly, that a financial advisor might help me optimize things. I asked what he thought needed optimizing. He said, "Well, at your age, estate planning becomes important. You want to make sure everything flows cleanly." I looked at him for a moment, and then I said, "I've been thinking about that too." That was the line I threw out, not as a lie, exactly. As an opening, he took it. Over the following months, the conversations became more frequent and more specific. He mentioned, through my daughter, that he had connections in estate planning. He offered to introduce me to someone. He suggested, gently, that having assets fragmented across multiple structures could create complications for heirs. He used the word heirs with a naturalness that turned my stomach slightly each time. My daughter was present for some of these conversations. She looked uncomfortable. She loved her husband, and she was beginning, I think, to understand something she did not want to understand. I played the role he needed me to play, a little confused, a little overwhelmed, grateful for the guidance. I told him I had some papers stored away that I hadn't looked at in years. I mentioned, offhandedly, that Dorothy had set up certain things before she passed, and I wasn't entirely sure where everything stood. I watched his eyes when I said that. They didn't change. He was better than most at keeping his face still. But something behind them shifted. He asked where the papers were. I said I kept important things at a storage unit over in Millbrook. Had for years. Dorothy's idea. Originally, she didn't trust keeping everything in the house after a neighbor was burglarized back in 2009. I said it was a bit of a mess, honestly. Years of files. I hadn't been there in a while. He said, carefully, that it might be worth going through everything together. Just so nothing falls through the cracks, he said. I said that sounded reasonable. I told him I'd set something up when my back felt better. I never did, but I had given him just enough. What I didn't tell him was that 3 weeks before that conversation, I had been to Millbrook. The storage unit was real. I had used it for years. But I had spent an afternoon removing anything of actual financial or legal value, every document, every certificate, every piece of paper that mattered. I replaced them with what remained. Old engineering manuals, boxes of holiday decorations, a broken lamp I'd never thrown away, 3 shoeboxes of photographs from the 1990s, and Dorothy's sewing supplies. I also placed, near the front of the unit, where it would be seen immediately, a single manila folder. Inside the folder was a handwritten note in my own handwriting, dated 6 years prior. The note read, "Everything has been taken care of. Trust is updated. You know where the real documents are. Don't leave the photographs. Michael should have them someday. Michael is my nephew. He lives in Portland. His name is not on any legal document related to my estate." Then I drove home, and I waited. I did not wait long. 4 weeks later, on a Thursday morning, I was at my kitchen table drinking coffee and reading the news when my phone rang. It was my daughter. Her voice was strange, tight, and controlled in the way it gets when she is trying not to cry. She told me that her husband had gone to Millbrook. I asked her how she knew. She said he had asked her, the night before, whether she knew which storage facility I used. She had told him she wasn't sure. Millbrook. Maybe. She'd heard me mention it once. She hadn't thought much of it. But that morning he had left early without explanation, and she had found, on his laptop, a search for the address of the Millbrook storage facility. I set down my coffee. I told her to stay home. I told her not to call him. I told her I would handle it and that I needed her to trust me for the next few hours. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, how long have you known?" I said, "Long enough." I called Carla first. She had been waiting for some version of this call for 2 years. She made 2 phone calls while I was still on the line with her. One to a contact at the Millbrook facility. We had already spoken to the manager months prior, and he understood that any attempt to access my unit without me present was to be documented and reported. The second call was to a private investigator named Dennis, who had done work for Carla's firm before. Dennis was already in his car within 20 minutes. By the time I pulled into the Millbrook parking lot, Dennis had been there for 45 minutes. He met me at the entrance with a calm expression and a folder. Inside the folder were 6 photographs. My son-in-law's car in the lot. My son-in-law speaking to the facility manager. The facility manager, following our instructions, precisely directing him to the wrong row, buying time. And then, in the final photograph, my son-in-law standing in front of Unit 44 with a pair of bolt cutters in his hand. Unit 44 was not my unit. My unit is 61. The manager had misdirected him, intentionally, as we had arranged. Unit 44 was empty, a recently vacated space that had not yet been re-rented. It was technically still accessible under facility rules for a brief inspection period. No laws were broken by the mistake. But my son-in-law did not know that. He had used bolt cutters on what he believed to be my storage unit. Dennis had it all on camera. I walked into the facility. My son-in-law was inside Unit 44 when I found him, standing over the empty concrete floor with a look on his face that I will remember for the rest of my life. It was not anger. It was not defiance. It was the look of a man who had just realized that the game had already ended. Several moves back, without his noticing. He heard my footsteps and turned around. I didn't raise my voice. Dorothy raised me to believe that the loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful one, and I have tried to live by that. I stood in the doorway and I looked at him for a long moment, and then I said, "You want to tell me what you're looking for?" He tried. He had a story prepared. He was in the area. He thought he might help me organize things. He tried my phone and got no answer. It was a decent story, well constructed. He told it smoothly. I let him finish. Then I told him about Carla. I told him about the trust, the restructured accounts, the documentation of every conversation in which he had asked about my finances. I told him about Dennis and the photographs. I told him that what he had done that morning, using bolt cutters on what he believed to be my property, was documented, witnessed, and already in Carla's hands. I told him that my daughter would be receiving a call from Carla that afternoon, explaining, in plain terms, exactly what her husband had been doing for the past 2 years. He went still. Then he said, quietly, "She doesn't need to know all of this." And I said, "She's my daughter. She needs to know everything." There is a particular silence that falls when a man understands that every card in his hand has already been seen. I have only heard it a few times in my life. It is not a loud silence. It is the silence of something ending. He left the storage facility without another word. I stood there for a moment in the empty unit, and I thought about Dorothy. I thought about that afternoon near the end, her hand in mine, the particular quality of the light coming through the hospice window. I thought about the specific and serious way she had asked me to watch. Not to fight, not to punish, just to watch and to protect and to make sure that what we had built together went where we intended it to go. I thought I had done that. The weeks that followed were not easy. My daughter is not a simple person, and this was not a simple thing. She did not fall apart. She is too much her mother's daughter for that, but she went quiet in a way that worried me more than tears would have. She asked Carla to walk her through everything personally. She asked me, once, whether I had ever considered being wrong about him. I told her honestly that I had, many times. She appreciated that. We don't agree on everything. We never have. But she is fair-minded, and she is thorough. And once she saw the full picture of the photographs, the documented conversations, the timeline Carla had assembled, she made her decisions calmly and with clarity. The divorce was filed 11 weeks after Millbrook. He contested nothing of substance. The prenuptial agreement my daughter had quietly signed, at my suggestion and Carla's drafting, 8 months before the wedding, was specific and thorough. There was very little to argue about. His attorney looked at the documentation and advised him to settle. He did. My daughter spent 3 weeks at my house after she moved out of theirs. We ate dinner together every night. We watched old movies she'd loved as a kid. I showed her, one evening, the folder from the storage unit, the fake note, the misdirection, all of it, and she laughed for the first time in weeks. Not a happy laugh, exactly. The laugh of someone who has been through something hard and come out the other side, still intact. She asked me when I had set it all up. I told her the fall before her wedding. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "Mom asked you to, didn't she?" I didn't answer right away. The kitchen was quiet. There was a pot of soup on the stove that had been there since that morning. The house looked exactly the way it had looked when Dorothy was alive, mostly because I hadn't changed very much. I said, "She asked me to watch. The rest was just engineering." My daughter smiled at that. It was a small smile and a real one, and it looked exactly like her mother's. What I kept in that storage unit was not what he was looking for. There was no document that would have changed his circumstances. There was no secret account, no hidden asset, no key to a vault he hadn't been able to find. The real valuables, the trust documents, the financial records, the things that actually mattered, were in Carla's office in a fireproof file cabinet where they had been for 2 years. What was in Unit 61, the real unit, the one he never reached, was what had always been there. Holiday decorations. Engineering manuals I couldn't bring myself to discard. A broken lamp, 3 shoeboxes of photographs. And Dorothy's sewing box, the wooden one with the brass latch that her own mother had given her. I had not been able to throw it away. I had not been able to keep it in the house, either not in the first year, when every room already felt like a memory pressing against the walls. So it had gone to Millbrook, along with the photographs and the lamp and the manuals, into a climate-controlled unit I paid $40 a month to maintain. I drove out to Millbrook one Saturday morning after my daughter had gone back to her own apartment. I opened Unit 61 with my key, the same key I had carried on my keychain for 11 years, and I stood in the familiar cool air, and I looked at everything quietly. I picked up Dorothy's sewing box, and I carried it to the truck. It sits on the shelf in the living room now. My daughter noticed it on her next visit and stopped in the middle of the room, and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she crossed to it and ran her hand along the lid, the way you touch things that carry more than their weight. She asked if she could have it someday. I told her it was already hers. Everything had always been hers. That is the thing about building something carefully. Over a long time, the value is never where the wrong people expect to find it. A man like my son-in-law spent 2 years studying the visible surface and never once thought to look at what was underneath. He saw accounts and property values and estate structures, and he calculated and he weighted and he maneuvered, and all the while, the real inheritance was sitting in a climate-controlled storage unit in Millbrook in a wooden sewing box with a brass latch. Not money, not documents. The shape of a woman's hands. The memory of 41 years. The proof that someone loved carefully and planned ahead and thought about the ones who would come after. Dorothy would have found the whole thing faintly amusing, I think. She had a dry sense of humor about human nature. She always said the most dangerous thing you could underestimate was a quiet person who had already thought everything through. I think about her every day. I think about the promise I made and the work it took to keep it. I think about my daughter's face, the morning she drove away from that house for the last time, and the morning 3 weeks later when she laughed for the first time, and the afternoon she held Dorothy's sewing box and understood without being told what it meant. I don't regret a single step, not one. If you are older, if you have built something over decades of early mornings and late nights and careful decisions, if you have watched your child fall in love with someone whose eyes move toward the exits when you talk about what matters to you, pay attention. Not from bitterness, not from cynicism, from love, Watch the way Dorothy asked me to watch. With patience, with preparation, with the quiet certainty that what you have built is worth the trouble of protecting. Talk to an attorney before you need one. Restructure before there is a crisis. Document the conversations that feel slightly off. Trust the instincts that have kept you upright for 60-something years. And keep the sewing box. Keep the photographs. Keep the things that are worth more than what they are worth. Because in the end, those are the things that matter. Those are the things that last. Everything else is just paperwork.